welcome everyone. I'm Tash to this talk, Designing Change Through Cross-Cultural Collaboration. It's great to have you here. And I'll start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands from wherever you're dialing in from. For me, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to pay my respect to elders past and present, and also acknowledge the continuing work done by those to preserve Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and communities, and pay my respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people we have in the audience. And now I'm going to hand over to my partner in crime in organising this event, Manami Ray.
Thanks, Tash. Hi, everyone. I'm Manami. Tash and I were both students in the Sugar program last year, 2019-2020, and had such a memorable and meaningful experience that we wanted to continue to unpack, share, and understand what it means for cross-cultural collaboration and how we can become better designers for it. So what is Sugar? Well, it's a global network bringing together corporate partners with students from 25 universities representing 4 continents. In this international setting, students get acquainted with human-centered design tools in an environment of cross-disciplinary, practice-based learning for the duration of 1 academic year. And we're excited to reflect on it today.
Great. And one tiny bit of housekeeping. I know that everyone's very accustomed to this online world that we now live in, but there is a Q&A function. So if you have any questions, our host, Chris, will potentially be able to weave them into conversation, or we might need to kind of take them on notice and follow up. But we'd love to continue any conversations that we have. So now I'll hand over to our facilitator for the evening, for our evening at least, Professor Christine Thom. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Tash. And very good point. In our evening, we have quite a bit of diversity here already across time zones, across universities, across cultures. So I'd like to not only welcome Tash and Manami, graduates of the program who are here in Melbourne with me, who were at Swinburne, but also my colleagues, Sushi Suzuki, Associate Professor at Kyoto Institute of Technology, and Professor Dr. Falk Übernickel, who is a professor at the Hassner-Plattner Institute in Potsdam, Germany, and also an adjunct at, I believe, and correct me if I'm getting this incorrect, Falk, at St. Garland's. So we have some people who have experienced the Sugar program from both a student perspective, a facilitation perspective, and a coaching perspective here. And what we're going to do is take advantage of that and go through and find out a little bit more about what diversity in design means to them, as well as going through what some of those challenges are, how to overcome those so we can use diversity effectively, and also why it's important. So we'll start off. I'd like to throw out to you, Tash, what diversity means to you as a designer. And of course, you know, we have people that come from different discipline backgrounds here as well. We're all trained in design thinking and know design thinking well, but not everyone are necessarily designers. So we've got beautiful diversity there too. But Tash, being a designer,
yeah,
what does diversity mean to you?
That's a big one. I think that for me, diversity is about difference. It's about everyone who arrives at the table, at the online meeting, at the drawing board, arrives from a completely different place with a different set of perspectives and experiences. And I think that when all of those can weave together, that's effective diversity. I think that diversity is pretty dynamic. It fluxes and changes, and sometimes different louder voices kind of bubble to the surface, and sometimes there's a bit of there can be a bit of tension as well. And I think that diversity, there's all sorts of different brands of it, which I'm sure we'll get into, but that's a brief kind of definition from me, Chris.
Awesome. And Sushi, now you've experienced the Sugar program from just about every perspective possible. What kinds of diversity do you think would be interesting to talk about in your experience? It's a pretty broad question, hey?
Yeah, it is. Eh? I mean, we're starting with some broad terminologies. I want to try pull the audience since we have 15 attendees, and just to get the chat going. I want everyone who's actually listening to this to actually write down where they're from, and also just write down one thing that they think makes them different from each other, and see what kind of diversity we have in the attendees as well, and to see what they think is important. But with regards to what we talk about, and the question was diversity in design, right?
Yes.
So from the kinds of work that we've been doing, which is very much product innovation, utilizing design thinking approaches with very vaguely defined topics, I think diversity is very much both in the perspectives that we have as kind of stemming from our own experiences related to like the topics at hand, and also the skills. And I think that's one of the things that's amazing about the Sugar Network is that most academic programs don't have a kind of place where students from different disciplines can come together, maybe engineering, business, design in many different forms, graphic, web, product, interaction. So I think those are kind of the two sections that we look into. And then of course the usual diversity metrics. I think when we think diversity from a layman's term, the first thing that comes to mind are things like ethnicity, socioeconomic background, or gender. But I think we, at least within the perspective of the Sugar Network, look a lot more beyond that. And I have a feeling that's probably where our conversation is going to be going today as well.
Cool. Thanks, Sushi. And Volk, maybe building on the idea of diversity in the Sugar Network, when we're putting together teams, what is the priority? We've sort of spoken about a range of different diversities. How do you prioritize team building, or team compositions rather? Tim.
Good question, Christine. So I believe there's no standard recipe, and it really depends on many external factors as well. So on one hand side, we have the collaborators that we are working together with, and also the different challenges. And as Tash and Sushi already pointed out, so diversity is not just one dimension, right? So it's about perspective, it's about experience in a field, it's about educational backgrounds, ethnicity, gender, skills, maybe level of creativity. So a lot of dimensions count in. And it's hard to say when you're starting to compose a team of, let's say, 5 to 7 students, to be able to cover all the different dimensions, right? It's almost impossible. So we have a limited pool of students that we are dealing with, and what we are trying to do is the best out of it, right? So we are trying to compose based on the project setting. But one is for sure, at least at Hasso-Plattner Institute, what we are almost interested in is not just the educational background then, but also having this diversity in perspective. So we asked, for example, the students to hand in kind of not the regular application materials, where we want to learn more about them, whatever that means, right? So we're not just curious in learning that they did an internship at company X or Y, but we are really trying to figure out if they had different kinds of life experiences already, even as young adults, right? Traveling might be a thing, or social work, another thing. And all this we put together in the selection process. And at least at HBI, I would say we don't have an algorithm, right? So we don't calculate percentages and weighting factors and then it makes thing. But it's an intense discussion of our experienced teaching team, where we just talk through the different CVs. And then we usually have a big board, so a physical board usually. And then we try to compose the team based on these different factors and things that we have learned about the people. And it's really a back and forth, highly iterative process, how that works. And that that's the magic, basically. I'm not sure if you're satisfied with this. I know there are other companies nowadays trying to use AI and whatsoever, and then they learn in a few minutes about Manami, for example, right? And then they try to make a judgment. But we believe it's a much more personal process that tries to weight these different dimensions that I was talking about, dependently on these those external factors. I mean, Sushi, you also have this much experience in playing around, right? So it's
Yeah,
I don't know you.
Also, team formation, I think you probably have the biggest challenge out of all of us because you usually have the most number of students, which, I mean, the possibilities increase exponentially. So when you have to make 4 teams, you got like 16 times more possibilities than like how you can form 2 teams. So I don't necessarily envy your challenge that you come to. And actually, one question I was thinking as we were talking through this is you mentioned earlier, like company trying to do AI. Do you also, in addition to your interviews and CVs, do you also do like a standardized survey or some kind of personality test of some kind as a factor?
Yeah, we tried to do that in the past. So we had different kinds of, so one was a standardized Myers-Briggs test many years ago, I think 10 or 9 years ago. And then we also moved on to another tool, but by the end of the day, we always ended up with, okay, let's do it manually again. And let's do proper interviews. Let's talk to the people, trying to figure out on the different dimensions of diversity. And so far, the human factors seem to work better than the algorithm. At least the algorithm doesn't seem to be superior. So I would say we always face the same difficulties than with the human factor and the human knows. But with the human factor, we at least had the chance to really talk in depth with all the participants. So it gave us also the chance as a teaching team to get to know them much better, right? Instead of just letting them run through a survey and then the system makes all the composition. Right? So yeah, so it already helped us to engage with them. And then maybe one more thing, as you know, as part of the Sugar program, we have this dry run in the beginning, the paper bike challenge, which is taking roughly 1 month before the real project work starts with the corporate partners. And in recent years, we experimented there a lot with different team compositions. So we changed by purpose the teams just to see how certain people behave. And again, then we had our human factor-based meetings, and we were constantly talking about the student participants, and we said, okay, this person might match with this person. They challenge each other properly, etc. And this helped us to make up the real team composition then.
Interesting. And how people work as in pairs versus 3s, 4s in the different dynamics is also always very interesting to see. From a lecturer professor viewpoint as well. But Manami, I'm interested to hear from you an example of a diverse team that you've been part of.
Sure. So coming from a global consulting financial services background, I thought, I understand what diversity is, but working with my team at HPI for the Sugar Project, which was a 9-month-long intense project where I actually got to travel. I traveled to China to meet them, and I traveled to Potsdam where we spent a week. So working together, and designers will relate together to solve a problem or find solutions, and working together is very different from working with diverse people and the challenges it raises. And I came across this term, which is cultural metacognition. And I finally feel I understand what that means. It's like, it's not just being aware of cultural differences, that's very superficial level, but it's actually being aware of your own biases and your own cultural biases that you have about people. And they say, you know, Aussies are like this, or Germans are like this, and how you need to tackle those when you're working in a diverse team, to a deadline, to a budget, to meet stakeholder expectations. Understanding all of that, understanding yourself becomes really important. So that's my one of my key takeaways when I actually worked in that diverse team as equals, where you're not necessarily the leader.
What kind of disciplines or cultures, what was the team composition? How big was the team that you're referring to?
So we started off with a team of 5, which grew to a team of 6. That was the student team. And then, of course, we had stakeholders who, one was, they were based in Switzerland. It was a Japanese company. The team from HPI came from various backgrounds as well, from Brazil, from Ireland, and there was myself, and we also had another student from who was an international student from China, but was actually more linked to Japan. So very, very diverse.
Yes, and Tash, you also had a bit of diversity in your team. I wonder if you might be able to share with us some of the challenges or a challenge that you experienced.
Yeah. So I feel like in my team, so there were 3 of us working from Swinburne University, working with 3 students from Kyoto Institute of Technology, KIT, where Sushi teaches. And one of the things that I really noticed was that I needed to practice being really patient when we were having conversations, when we were generating ideas, because I really noticed this about myself, is that I get excited. I want to talk about things. I want to, you know, spitball and say yes, say no, go down different pathways. But I felt like there were members of my team in the Australian contingent, as well as the Japanese students I was working with, who were very differently paced. And sometimes I felt like I would get 2 hours into a conversation and this gold would just bubble up to the top, and I would just wonder why that wasn't where we started talking, because it was so brilliant, and I wish that that's where we could have started. And so I think that for me it was just calming down. I mean, I can feel myself right now talking in a million miles an hour. You know, I think that it's like Manami said, it's very much an awareness of self as much as it is about other people.
Wonderful. So how do you think the diversity, like the challenges with diversity, so, you know, it's 2-hour meeting conversation you're having, how did that impact the design content and output of your project?
Well, I think that for sure it made it better. It made it more difficult. I mean, I think that it would be misleading to say that working in a diverse team is easy. I think that it is really difficult to work with people who aren't like you, but that's part of why it makes it really important. I would say that the outcomes were richer, they were deeper. I was more confident that they would be successful because different people had come to a conclusion and agreed with them, and that they were more robust in that kind of sense. It's like what they say, like you can't just design for yourself, because then you've got a really narrow target audience. So I think that by working in a diverse team where people with different perspectives, like we've spoken about, have arrived at the same solution, I think that shows that there's more behind it. It's a better design.
Awesome. Sushi, what are some of the challenges that you've seen in cross-cultural collaboration?
Oh, where to start, right?
Maybe what's the most humorous? Let's start with some humor.
Whoa, okay, that was not particularly easy to come up with. I mean, the usual player, humorous. Oh, you threw me up on that one.
Well, you can start with, what's
Yeah,
one that you
maybe
see the most? What's the most
let
common
me,
thing?
as I'm thinking, it might come up, but the obvious ones are just, I mean, the language, not necessarily even just speaking English, but like a lot of cultures communicate differently. A lot of cultures emphasize different parts. One of the challenges that I'm sure, Tosh, you've fully enjoyed is the fact that Japan is a very high-tech contextual society. So we don't particularly say things straight out. There's a lot of in between the line reading that happens within the communication between two Japanese people, which can be understood by the fact that like a lot of the things that we say don't have subjects. The subject is understood in a Japanese statement or sentence. Lots of that. So I have to hammer this onto my students, but like all the things that you kind of got from, we metaphorically say, reading the air in Japan, that does not work in other places. Like you're gonna have to be a lot more explicit. And I think they struggle with that. When I say they, like my students who are Japanese, I think they struggle with that, not necessarily just with their global partners, but by the fact that we also have international students within our teams as well, from France, who do we have last year? From America, from different countries. So I think they struggle there as well, where they think they're actually communicating, but they realize like it's not going through at all. That's definitely one of the hardest of cross-cultural. And then there's also the cross-cultural of disciplines, because we're a very multidisciplinary program where students from different backgrounds come in. There's vocabulary within each discipline, but also what good looks like. So what good looks like for an engineering student may not be what good looks like for a design student. For example, like engineers and engineering students are generally judged by how well they build something, but not necessarily how well that built something is actually fitting the needs of someone or whatnot. It's very much like flexing the engineering muscles to say like, hey, I've managed to design and complete this very complicated technical system, where in reality, what was needed was a much simpler, easier to understand thing. And I think this is also where you can see some conflict starting to happen within at least the sugar program. Sorry, no humor in that. Nothing's coming to mind yet.
That's quite okay. That might be a good note to finish on at the end. Minami, I was wondering if you could also share an experience that you had with cross-cultural conflict or challenges with diversity in teams, and how that has influenced the performance as a team in terms of your design work.
Yeah, I always, think about theory and practice. So reading about the iceberg model, and you go, the tip of the iceberg is what you see and what you show yourself. And then there's so much in depth of you. And in practice, what happens is that's where the conflict happens. Because when you show yourself initially, it's like, you're polite. Hi, I'm Minami. What happens then is you are knee deep into a project. You come from different backgrounds. Everyone thinks, just like Sue says, what does good look like? And the personalities and your background in terms of diversity of thought and diversity of experience comes in. So being used to being a senior in my previous roles, I'm direct, might come across as a bit blunt. It doesn't always go down well. So, and it gives rise to conflict. In saying that, I felt that all the conflict that we had in our team made our process better, because we had to keep going. And as you do in a real life project, you have to keep going, and you are forced to tackle it head on in a mature way, not like children and not like, being in a school classroom or whatever, because you're dealing in a real life project. And that conflict, I think, gives rise to not just personal growth, but growth in the project, because that's where that cross-cultural collaboration actually means. Because if there's no conflict, and if you're all just agreeing on everything, then where is the diversity of thinking? Where is the challenges coming from? Until we challenge each other's thought processes and why are you doing that, or why are you thinking that, you don't get the diversity of thought, which gives rise to that whole innovation, new ideas, new ways of thinking. So that's the conflicts. Sometimes I felt are solved by putting it out there and then in silence, and you let it sit, and then the conversation restarts. And that quite often would happen in our team, but we would then restart the conversation and move on from there. So understanding people's viewpoints.
Cool. And I like how it influences not just the output, but the process itself.
Yeah,
of designing. Folk, you have quite a lot, you've seen a lot of teams go through the Sugar program. Quite often with high-performing teams, we know there's the forming, norming, storming, performing stages, maybe adjourning, generally always at the end. Do you think all teams need to go through that? Because we are, we're creating these environments where there's tension. We're trying to find this sweet spot in tension. Do you think they all have to go through a bit of hard times?
Yeah, I mean, I know this Tuckman framework. I would not say that every team needs to go through. I mean, I saw a lot of teams that never went through the storming phase and still performed on a surprisingly high level. Maybe they would have done even better if they would have run through the storming. But a lot of teams are just doing it. I mean, they just run through the storming phase. And I mean, I was listening carefully what you all said about course collaboration and all the advantages, but it is, as you also said, hard work for most of the students. And I think this is also our responsibility of teachers, like Zishi and me and you, Christine, to enforce this kind of this drag into this storming phase, right? And to let everyone perceive what it means to have this necessary conflict, like Manami said, because we are not talking about personal conflicts, right? Maybe just for the audience, we are talking about constructive conflicts, which sometimes seem to be personal conflicts. But what we need to do with our students is to teach them that these are two separate things, right? And that they need to realize that these constructive conflicts are helping us to gain new perspectives, to see things differently, also to get new ideas. And in that regard, I think it's helpful if students run through the storming phase, because then they fully feel what it means to be in such a phase, and then they can also leverage their potential much better as soon as they start performing. But it's not a must be, but I think for every student in the program, it's a big plus and a big learning to go through such a phase. And I know also some students who then drop out of the class, right? It just happened with one young student. We couldn't convince her to stay and to just wait a few more days or weeks. But this I think it's part of such a program, and I'm sure even she will learn after a year the value of that phase. I'm pretty much sure. So yeah, yes and no. So it's maybe important, but I wouldn't be too much fixated on let every team run through a storming phase. It's also not that needed. Yeah. I mean, it's also sometimes just cool to see teams who just perform, right? Yeah, but they miss maybe one part of the learning journey. Then.
And I think the support of the team dynamics, not necessarily always just supporting what is happening with project and deliverables and designing something, but how do you actually work together, and spending time on that can be a really effective part of that storming, or an alternative to that storming process and that learning.
And I mean,
yeah.
I think it's also important to see what do we want to achieve as part of the sugar community, right? And sure, on one hand side, we are collaborating with the industry to aim for superior innovation outcomes, kind of product, services, etc. But on the other hand, we're a university, right? We are here to teach people aspects that they might find useful in their future career, right? And therefore, it is also part of our responsibility to show them not only the sunny side of the world, but also all the shadows, right? In a positive sense, right? Because the university itself, and thanks also to all the corporate partners, they create a kind of protected bubble, right? Where no one really gets harmed, but you can still see the shadows of yourself, of your team, of whatever, right? And you can try out yourself or with your team to how to fix it. And therefore, having this storming phase is a kind of shadow phase, right? And at least the corporate partners that I'm aware of, all of them are super supportive, helpful. They sometimes see themselves into this team, right? And some of those even told me, I wish I had this experience in my studies or in my previous life. So yeah, that's my perspective also on the storming phase. I mean, in the corporate world, it might be a bit different. But anyway, acting out the storming phase might be sometimes even there super helpful.
I think something that you've mentioned there and that Minami brought up earlier, that level of awareness, and we teach to doing design thinking, we're empathizing with the user. You also need to empathize with other stakeholders, including your team. So how you can engage that, and that might be one of the ways to collaborate effectively. Tash, I'm interested to hear any other ways that you may have managed some of the challenges of collaborating in a diverse environment in your experience.
So I was really proud of our team and how we managed that. I think we did a really good job. And I think that there are two things which really stick out to me, which meant that we had a successful project. I think that was rewarding for me as a student, as a design practitioner, and as a person as well. The first of those was when we had a global kickoff session where all of us met in China and met our corporate sponsors, and we got to know the team members, is we drew up a team charter which had agreements that we made to each other. And some of them were like, have fun. And some of them were things like make sure that you respond to messages within a certain time frame, make sure that you listen to all of the ideas, but also make sure that you contribute all of your ideas. Like don't keep anything to yourself. And that was right from the beginning. And that kind of prefaced the entire project, which I think was really valuable. And the other thing which, I take that into my practice now as well, but probably the other thing which was quite more revelatory for me was we started to kind of pair off. And some of these pairings were arbitrary, some of them were discipline-based. So, the graphic designers work with the graphic designers, the engineers work with the engineers. At that stages in the project, we just needed to activate. You just need to roll up your sleeves and get stuff done. It was easier to work with somebody who shared your discipline, but maybe was from a different culture, background, age, gender. And then there were the really nice relationships, the nice pairings, which were based on interests. So somebody who actually had something in common with, who you might be likely to become friends with outside of this strange sugar experience. And I think that having those different kind of connections, which were sometimes within your local team, so sometimes weren't geographically dispersed and sometimes they were, and they would kind of just activate and simmer as needed throughout the project. And you you kind of always felt like you had someone in your team. You always felt like you had someone you could talk to one-on-one, because sometimes it's easier to have those difficult conversations when it's just one or two other people. But then together, those connections make the whole team really, really much stronger, I think. So yeah, on reflecting on my experience, those are probably the two things, with the latter being the most, most interesting to me. I think that a team is kind of the sum of the strong little parts that are connected.
Cool. Thanks, Tash. And Manami, I was wondering if you might be able to build on that with your experience as well, and being part of a geographically dispersed team. And what are some of the things you did to work effectively?
So yeah, I agree with Tash that the partnering up was really important. So we had that whole geographical border partnering to work on things. We'd start off team meetings sometimes with little icebreaker activities, because we realized that in our team dynamics, we were all sort of very work focused and project focused, which is great. But when it came to conflict resolution, if you don't have those underlying strong relationships, that can make it difficult to resolve the conflict. So having icebreaker, get to know you, just that informal, even if it's talking about the weather, which, you know, when you're geographically located in different, you know, it's different in Australia, different in Germany, really helps. And pre-COVID, like, we did all of this on Zoom and Slack and all the tools that are there. So even though I did physically get to travel, most of the time we were online. And so using those tools, using technology to help you deepen those connections. And for example, one of the first icebreakers we did was we took Vegemite to our global kickoff, so people could have a taste of Australia. And we filmed those reactions of our teammates, and that was a great icebreaker, because you know, what's more fun than sharing, you know, food and talking about food, and that kind of brought up, you know, your childhood memories of food and things like that. So those kind of fun icebreaker activities, which seem so trivial, I think really helps in team building and team bonding and establishing those little routines along the way, not just at the start, but throughout the project.
I think that Vegemite example is a great one in terms of expectations as well. You look at it, a lot of people think, oh, it's going to be like Nutella. This is going to taste sweet. And you get this umami, savoury attack of your tongue. So the expectations and things not being what they seem is a nice little learning in there too.
Do you think Vegemite is more effective than Tim Tams?
We took Tim Tams too.
You start with one, you sweeten with the other.
Yes.
Now, Sushi, you mentioned a couple of challenges there, and a range of things around language and, you know, having to read between the lines. How do you get around things? You don't know what you don't know. So what are some of the ways that, you know, you can support more effective cross-cultural collaborations in those sorts of situations?
So, well, okay, you just use the term, you don't know what you don't know, but you can also know what you don't know, right? And that's really just awareness. Like, are you aware that people are different, or people can think in an entirely different way, etc.? And that's one thing that I feel very fortunate about teaching in Japan. Like, we call our, jokingly, a little self-deprecantly, like, Japan calls itself the Galapagos, because we are an island nation at the edge of the Pacific that developed very uniquely. We had 250, 300 years of isolation that only fell apart, what, like 150 years ago? So Japanese people are very well aware that they are different culturally and in the way that they do things. So in that sense, they are very attuned to the fact that there may be people who behave or think differently, even though they've never seen it before, they don't know how to deal with it. And sometimes it may just really push on their sensibilities, especially working with Western cultures, the stronger ones like the US, where there can be team members can be very, very pushy with their ideas or their beliefs. And I try to do my best to sort of talk about that as well. And I guess I'm fortunate enough in the sense that I've had my own personal diversity of having lived in 4 or 5 different countries. So that's at least step one. And I think sometimes getting to that awareness can be challenging for some other cultures. Especially, I don't know, this might be a little bit of a dangerous statement, but I feel like the people who are not the best at this, and again, huge 3,000-mile point of view, is the US. Because the US consider themselves to be so diverse, which they are, they believe that everything the way they think is kind of reflected within their own society. But the US also has its own domineering culture. I mean, they call themselves a melting pot for a reason, where people do come to America from all sorts of backgrounds, but they also do become significantly American in that process, to the point where they may not be so aware of the fact that there are other ways of thinking and working outside of their own borders. And Japanese Americans are very different from Japanese people if they're 4 generations removed.
Excellent and controversial point, perhaps. Volk, in your experience, and you work and live across 2 countries, how have you, what would you say is a really important thing to support cross-cultural collaboration in design?
I think,
for
yeah,
design?
I mean, Sushi made already the point. I think this cross-cultural collaboration is almost every time boiling down to awareness topic in the beginning, at least. So, and what I sometimes realize is that my students here in Europe, I mean, as part of their ongoing life, for sure, they traveled a lot already, most of them, also to different continents. But then they get confused that this travel experience means already cultural awareness, right? So they said, yeah, I have been to Tunisia already, so I know how it is, right? Or I've been to Australia 5 days or for a 2-week vacation, right? I know how it is. And I think this is sometimes complicating the process, because they already get preoccupied with some themes of the culture, and then they believe that they can already manage it, right? And these are the most difficult situations. I think it's easier with people who don't have that experience, or who do not believe that, because then they are much more open to talk with them and to show them what it really means. But the ones who have a preoccupied mind, with them to work together, it's harder. Yeah. So, but when I'm trying to help them with cross-cultural teams, I mean, we sometimes had cultural coaches in Switzerland and in Germany. So especially when we collaborated the first time with a Chinese team at Tongji University, I tried to invite someone who grew up there, like Sushi, for example, in Japan, but he knows how Germany is, for example, because he lived there. He lived in Frankfurt, I think 2-3 years, right? So you're almost German. So but you know, these people help a lot, because they can build bridges, right? Then what I also learned is to tell them to address conflict soon, and not to believe that they can solve it by themselves immediately. So we try to give them also a helping hand from the teaching team, and tell them, hey guys, if there's a problem, just tell us. Maybe we tell you, try to solve it, right? But sometimes it's not doable by the participants themselves, and then we get in and we facilitate the process then to make it smoother or make it really a learning experience. Yeah. So these are the things, and then to overcome these issues, what I personally learned is that most teams will become better as soon as they have a shared vision and mission. And I mean, in our sugar teams, it usually happens as part of the funky functional phase. But you know, having that mission is then also helping for the rest of the process, because it synchronizes the goals, the achievements, and then, you know, it's kind of channeling the things, and this is where I see most of the effects then happening, that teams are getting together, they form a pack, and then they strive for this one particular goal. I'm not sure what your observation is, Sushi, but at least this, as soon as they have this vision, mission, it's usually getting better.
Generally, yes, I would say. First of all, when you said like teams get together, have this common vision at Funky, I'm like, that's idealistic. Like if they could get together around mid-February, I'll be really happy, because it usually takes around till like now for the teams to really cohese and get the final vision of what they want to do. One thing when I was listening to it, I was thinking is like, man, it would be nice if like my students were better at asking for help. And this is also something very, very cultural. Like, I think there are certain cultures that very much like, I don't want to go as far as say repress their feelings, but they don't want to show weakness, and asking for help is very much that. And I get a bit more of that in Japan versus in other cultures I've worked in. Teams are more open to being visible with their conflict, as well as also asking coaches or the teaching team for help. And that's something that I've struggled with in Japan, not just in sugar, but also other student projects as well, because the teams really like hold it in until things explode. And one of the interesting things that an American I know in Japan that once mentioned is that Japanese people are masters at avoiding conflict, but they're absolute amateurs at resolving it. And I think Western cultures, I don't want to tie it all in together, but I think a lot of Western cultures are the other way around. Like they're used to conflict, but they're also used to conflict resolution, which is not really that big of a concept here.
We need to practice, right? You need to have conflict to be good at resolving it.
Yeah, and sometimes they say to the teams that have had this explosive conflict with tears and people screaming is like, well, I don't say it at the time, but like a couple months later when the project is finishing up, I'm like, yeah, you guys went through a pretty good experience. Now you're prepared for at least this level of conflict.
And I think, and we're using it, and Falk made the point earlier, conflict isn't always a negative or a personal thing. And so how you start to view conflict can be a really important thing as well. We've got a bit of one question coming through and starting to come to the close. So I think, you know, why diversity is important has come through in a lot of the answers so far. But I'd like to ask all panel members what their one takeaway might be. So for a designer wanting to engage in cross-cultural collaboration, what's one of the most valuable, important, or, you know, insider tip or trick that you would like to share? So Tasha's got a really large smile on her face. So I'm going to start with Tash, and I'm also moving across my screen. You're first up.
It's a default, Chris. I smile when I sleep as well. Well, I can see the question from BM, which is about how the pandemic has affected cross-cultural collaboration and diverse teams. And I think that you know, moving in, I purposefully avoided the word pivot there, and now I've just gone and said it. But anyway, I think that for me, my takeaway is that people are people, right? Like, so people are arriving from a diverse place, bringing all of what's happening around them and has come before them, but they, you know, they want what's best. And I think that, you know, as designers, like, we want to fill the brief, we want to be able to have the best solution. And I think that if you just remember that the people who you're working with and for are people, and now sure, they're a person who's dialing in from their dining room table, they're a person who now needs to leave between 3 and 4 to collect their kids, because that's just what the world is like at the moment. I think that for me it was start with that as a default. Like, if assume positive intent, assume that somebody from a different discipline from you is worried about different things than you're worried about, but that has value, you know, that's contributing to this vision that you've definitely established early on in the project, and go from there and learn from there, I think, is probably my takeaway. I don't think that would fit on a billboard, but so I'm starting.
People are people. That's a headline.
So I want to follow up on this question from BM as well, just kind of going through the experiences. More for us, it was last academic year than this one, because we're mostly in person still at our university. But one of the things that pandemic did, and everyone being thrown to home, is that it really messed with the space-time continuum. As in, like, usually, at least in our kind of unique setup of having 2 universities, a team in each, like, those teams would get together in like an open space within the university, work together, and then they would collaborate maybe once, twice a week on Zoom, back then Skype. But once everyone got to home, like, it didn't matter if you're 5 kilometers away, 5 minutes away, or 500 kilometers away, you were all at home on Zoom. And in that sense, this like 4 people here, 4 people here kind of got put into like 8 people on the Zoom world. And I thought that had some really interesting consequences of everyone kind of feeling together like one team, where it was always like the Australian side and the Japan side, and being able to run sort of SGM small group meetings together. But then there were, of course, the negatives as well of not having any tacit communication or like side communication, because every time you got onto Zoom, generally it was kind of focused, kind of let's get work done. And it was not like horsing around and kind of just having fun because you just happened to be there, or being able to break out into 2 different communications within the same room or things like that.
Thanks, Sushi. Folk, what would be your takeaway?
Yeah, so for diversity, Christine, or
for diversity, for designers wanting to work in, why should they work in cross-cultural teams?
I mean, I would like to emphasize the broader theme, maybe, because I mean, diversity, especially in the sugar setting, it opens up the possibility for our students to become this what we call global citizens, right? So we need to get rid of this thinking of borders, and so I do not want to say we need to get rid of countries themselves, but I mean, if we want to solve bigger problems like sustainability or the pandemic, I mean, viruses don't know borders, right? Air pollution doesn't know borders, right? It doesn't matter if the pollution happens in Germany or in the southern part of Europe or in Australia. It all affects our globe, right? And what we need to learn is to become these global citizens and to act together, and to act together with our different diverse point of views, right? We need to learn that. Only then we are able to hopefully solve this sustainability challenge and many other challenges that we face nowadays. So therefore, diversity is not just something that's important to work together with organizations in particular projects, but it's also this meta-learning for our students that only we as societies together can solve the biggest challenges. And therefore we need to overcome this viewpoint that diversity is hard. We need to see it as an advantage, right? We need to see it as a positive thing in order to tackle these bigger challenges.
Thanks, Paul. Manami.
I'll be really quick. Mine is literally peep over your fence and talk to your global neighbor. Whether it's through a conference, whether it's through a global project, take the chance and talk to your global neighbours and get to know them.
I think that underpins trust, how you form trust. And Sushi, you had a final message?
Yeah, so you kept mentioning kind of like at the individual level, right? As a designer, what could one do? And I would say increase your personal diversity. Try to get different kinds of experiences, go places, work with a lot of different people. I mean, I think the Sugar Network is a great opportunity for that, but there are plenty of other academic programs, or make your own. Travel and find a workshop in Morocco or volunteer in Nigeria. I think there's a lot of opportunities, and that really, I think, will open up your perspective from being able to kind of leave your own biases and own perspectives that you grew up with. And I guess I'm fortunate enough that I've been able to live in a lot of different places just because of my consequences when I was smaller. So I'm really thankful for that. But I think a lot of people can also do it even if they've lived in the same country for like 20 years to start off their life.
Wonderful. And I think something that the whole team and everyone mentioned at some point was awareness. And awareness is something that you can work on and that will actually increase creativity. So there's absolute motivation for designers to build that awareness muscle. But I'll hand back to Tash and Minami. We're just on 7:30 and we'll wrap up.
Yeah, we recruited a good, efficient facilitator, didn't we? Thank you so much, Chris, Sushi and Falk, and of course, Minami. Would you like to say some closing words, Minami, before we sign off?
I would really like to show my appreciation for meeting in different time zones. Thank you so much, Falk, Sushi, and Chris, as always. What a great conversation. We would love to hear what you think. So please put any comments or questions in the Q&A and we can keep this conversation going. Thank you, everyone.